Hello everybody, Shrouded Hand here. Today we're looking at a crime so brutal that a pathologist described the injuries as the worst he'd ever seen. This is the horrific murder of Kelly Ann Bates. James Patterson Smith and Kelly Ann Bates were an unlikely couple. James, a divorcee in his mid-40s, and Kelly, a 16-year-old girl fresh out of high school. He'd met her 2 years earlier in 1993 when she babysat for a friend and he offered to walk her home. From that point onwards, he began to groom Kelly Ann, contacting her in secret behind her parents' back. 2 years later, when she left school, he had enough control over her to convince her to move into his house in Furnivall Road, Gorton. Kelly initially kept James's age a secret, and it was only a long time after the relationship started that they were actually allowed to meet him. Kelly's mother, Margaret Bates, says that when she first met James, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she tried everything she could to get Kelly Ann away from him. She says she had the strange urge to pick up a bread knife from her kitchen counter and plunge it into his back to stop him from taking her daughter away. I find this detail interesting. There's been some studies to suggest that psychopathic criminals give off a kind of intangible, creepy vibe. Often after meeting psychopaths, people will report that they made their skin crawl, even when they were being perfectly friendly. Some of us seem to have evolved a deep-rooted instinct to identify predatory people. Without knowing anything about James Smith, Margaret Bates knew that she was encountering evil. Unbeknownst to Kelly Ann and her parents, James Patterson Smith had a long history of abusing the women in his life. 13 years before meeting Kelly Ann, his then-wife divorced him because of his abusive behaviour towards her. He then began to date 20-year-old Tina Watson, who he used as a human punching bag, even when she was pregnant with his child. The relationship ended after Smith attempted to drown Watson while she was in the bath. After they broke up, James Smith began seeing a 15-year-old girl named Wendy Mottershead. Again, he was violently abusive towards her, at one point attempting to drown her by holding her head underwater in the kitchen sink. As horrific as these stories are, it seems that James Smith's exes got away lightly, because what he was going to do to Kelly Ann Bates was much, much worse. Within weeks of Kelly Ann moving in with James Smith, it was clear that something was wrong. They would fight a lot, often splitting up temporarily, during which time Kelly Ann would move back in with her parents. They noticed that she seemed increasingly withdrawn and untalkative. Her clothes were unkempt and her hair unwashed. She would sit in a corner with her head down, seeming depressed. Sometimes she would turn up with bruises or bite marks on her body. She always managed to explain it away or simply told her parents not to worry about it. Increasingly worried, her parents contacted the authorities, but the police were unable to intervene because Kelly was over the age of 16, which is the age of consent in the UK. Unbeknownst to them, James Smith was using their concern against them. Their attempts to help Kelly Ann were twisted to make it seem like they were interfering and overbearing. He used this to further distance her from her parents, until one day she moved out, never to see them again. This was in November 1995, and from that day onwards, she only spoke to her parents on the phone, and those calls became increasingly infrequent. On birthdays and anniversaries, Kelly's parents would receive cards from her, but they noticed the handwriting on the card wasn't hers. It seemed that James was sending the cards on her behalf. Sensing that something was wrong, Kelly's brother visited the house on Furnivall Road and asked to see her, but he was told that she wasn't home. On another occasion, a concerned neighbour asked how Kelly was doing, but was only allowed to see her briefly in an upstairs window. The last time Kelly Ann's parents spoke to her was a phone call on the 10th of March 1996. On April 16th, James Smith walked into a local police station and calmly told them Kelly has drowned in the bath. Upon investigating the scene, it was clear to police officers that this was no simple drowning. There was blood in every room of the house, and Kelly Ann's body was covered in horrific injuries. Smith was taken into custody. When the police arrived at Kelly Ann's parents' house, the first thing Margaret Bates said was, "He's killed her." The exact timeline of events leading up to Kelly Ann's death are unknown. It's only through an examination of her injuries that we're able to get some idea of the ordeal that she went through. We know that she was being abused from the very early days of the relationship. Sometime in December 1995, she quit her part-time job, and it was around this time that she stopped contacting her family, apart from the occasional phone call. It seems that Smith was keeping her captive from that point onwards, and it's safe to assume that the physical abuse was slowly ramped up over this period. The worst of the abuse, though, seems to have been carried out over a period of about 4 weeks leading up to her death. Her body had over 150 separate injuries in various states of healing, showing that she'd been continuously tortured over the 4-week period. Her eyebrows, lips, nose, ears, and genitals were horribly mutilated. There were stab wounds to the inside of her mouth. Her body was covered in stab wounds from knives, scissors, and forks. There were also deep wounds caused by a garden spade and pruning shears. There was scalding to her buttocks and left leg, most likely from boiling water. There was also a large burn from a clothing iron on her thigh. Part of her scalp had been torn away. She had been starved, losing 44 pounds in weight in those final 3 weeks. She also hadn't been given water for several days before her death. Her kneecaps and the bones in her hand had been shattered with a blunt object. Her arm had also been fractured. This would have rendered her completely immobile and unable to defend herself. Despite this, he still kept her restrained, either by tying her to a radiator with her own hair or keeping her in a hole underneath the floorboards. Worst of all, though, he'd gouged out both her eyes. It's not known exactly how far into the ordeal that this happened, but forensic examiners say that it happened at least 5 days before her death, and it could have been 3 weeks beforehand. To make matters worse, there were stab wounds inside the sockets that occurred sometime after the eyeballs were removed. This was probably the worst part of the ordeal. If you think about how bad it hurts just to get a speck of dust in your eye, it's not hard to imagine how getting your eyes gouged out is one of the most painful things a person can endure. Afterwards, the empty sockets are painful open wounds full of exposed nerves. Any further trauma to this area can be even more painful than the eye removal itself. There's an eerily similar case of a woman named Tina Nash who was severely assaulted by her boyfriend. He choked her unconscious and then gouged out her eyes. He then threw her into a bath and shoved her head underwater. She describes the pain of the cold water hitting her empty eye sockets as if someone was shoving red-hot pokers in there. If cold water can cause that much pain, imagine how sadistic a person has to be to repeatedly stab someone in their empty eye sockets. That person was James Smith, a true psychopathic sadist who relished in the prolonged abuse of a defenseless girl. During his trial, the prosecutor said, "It was as if he was deliberately disfiguring her, causing her the utmost pain, distress, and degradation. The injuries were not the result of one sudden eruption of violence. They must have been caused over a long period. The injuries were so extensive and so terrible that the defendant must have deliberately and systematically tortured the girl. It was enough to cause anguish and torment to the point of mental breakdown and collapse." Her final moments, although brutal, must have come as a blessed relief. Smith dragged Kelly-Ann into the bathroom and smashed her round the head with the shower attachment until she fell unconscious into the bath where she drowned. Amazingly, during his trial, James Smith tried to claim that most of her injuries were self-inflicted. He said that she would goad him into hurting her, then she would injure herself further to make the wounds seem worse than they were. When asked why he'd removed her eyes, he said that she dared him to do it, mocking his dead mother to send him into a fit of rage. It took the jury less than 1 hour to find him guilty of the torture and murder of Kelly-Ann Bates. Despite the speed of the sentencing, the pictures shown in court of Kelly-Ann's injuries were so disturbing that every member of the jury required counselling afterwards. James Patterson Smith was sentenced to a minimum of 20 years behind bars, with the recommendation that he never be released. Psychologists diagnosed him as a sadistic psychopath with a paranoid personality disorder who would always be a danger to women. Luckily, he's still languishing in jail to this day. So that's the end of the video, and I hope you found it informative. Massive thanks to everyone supporting the channel. Hopefully it doesn't seem in bad taste to thank patrons at the end of a video like this, but then I wouldn't be able to cover these sort of topics if I had to try and be advertiser friendly, so I can't really go without showing my appreciation in some way. Thank you for watching, and until next time, goodbye.